What if I told you that one of the most feared armies in world history wasn't made up of men, but women? For centuries, when people spoke of great warriors, kings, generals, and armies, they thought only of men. Yet in West Africa, from the 17th to the 19th centuries, there existed a fighting force so fearless, so disciplined, and so ferocious that European observers compared them to the legendary Amazons of Greek mythology. These women were no myth. They were very real. They were the Mino of Dahomey, known to the outside world as the Dahomey Amazons, but to their people, they were Ennon Miton, meaning our mothers. Their story begins in the Kingdom of Dahomey, in what is today the Republic of Benin. Founded in the early 1600s, Dahomey quickly grew into one of the most centralized and militarized states in Africa. Its power was built on warfare, raiding, and the transatlantic slave trade, which supplied European ships with captives in exchange for weapons and goods. To sustain this brutal cycle, Dahomey required a constant, reliable, and formidable army. It is within this context that the Mino emerged. Some historians trace their origins to groups of women hunters, particularly those skilled in tracking and killing elephants. These hunters were already exceptional figures in a society where most women were expected to stay within domestic roles. Their skills, strength, and resilience made them ideal candidates to serve in the palace guard. King Agaja, who ruled around 1645 to 1685, is often credited with forming the first all-female bodyguard unit. What began as a palace guard soon evolved. Under King Agaja, who ruled from 1718 to 1740, this female contingent transformed from simple protectors into a full-fledged military regiment. Over time, their role expanded further, and they became a key part of Dahomey's battlefield strategy. By the mid-1800s, their numbers had swelled dramatically. Reports suggest that between 1,000 and 6,000 women served as Mino at any given time, forming as much as a third of the entire Dahomean army. This was not a ceremonial force. This was not symbolic. This was a living, breathing, fighting machine, and it was composed entirely of women. The rise of the Mino shocked Europeans who encountered them. To colonial observers, the idea of women taking up arms was unthinkable. Yet in Dahomey, these warriors were not only accepted, but celebrated as symbols of the kingdom's strength. The Mino were not merely protectors of the throne. They were Dahomey itself, a living representation of its power, resilience, and defiance against enemies near and far. Recruitment into the Mino came in many forms. Some women joined voluntarily, drawn by the promise of freedom, independence, and status that would have been impossible to achieve in traditional society. For many, it was an escape from forced marriages, poverty, or the limitations placed upon them as women in ordinary life. Others, however, were not given a choice. Some were conscripted after their villages were conquered. Some were even presented to the king by their own families, either as tribute or as a way to gain royal favor. Regardless of how they entered, once a woman became a Mino, her old life was gone forever. She was reborn into a world of discipline, loyalty, and sacrifice. One of the most striking aspects of their service was the strict vow of celibacy. The Mino were considered wives of the king, though not in the sense of romantic or conjugal partners. Instead, this status meant that their lives were wholly devoted to the king and the kingdom. They were no longer daughters, wives, or mothers in the traditional sense. They belonged to Dahomey. Their daily lives were defined by intense and unrelenting training. Girls could be recruited as young as 8 years old, though serious military instruction usually began later. From the start, they were pushed to their physical and psychological limits. They trained in endurance, running long distances under the harsh West African sun. They practiced survival tactics, learning to navigate forests, swamps, and rivers with minimal supplies. They were hardened against pain and fear. Weapons training was central. At first, they mastered traditional arms, such as clubs, knives, and spears. But as European traders brought firearms into West Africa, the Mino quickly adapted. They became skilled musketeers, later mastering more advanced rifles like the Winchester. To fight up close, they trained with machetes, which could be used with devastating effect in hand-to-hand combat. Beyond the physical training, training, they also underwent psychological conditioning. They were taught not to fear death, but to embrace the possibility of sacrifice. Their motto was stark and uncompromising: conquer or die. They were expected to be unflinching, to charge even when outnumbered, and to face enemies with the knowledge that retreat was not an option. The Mino lived together in special barracks within the royal palace compound. This created a strong sense of sisterhood and unity. They ate together, trained together, and fought together. This life forged bonds that went beyond ordinary military camaraderie. They were not simply soldiers, they were a family, united by discipline, loyalty, and the shared knowledge that their entire lives were dedicated to the service of the king. To outsiders, this way of life seemed harsh, even brutal. But within Dahomey, being a Mino carried honor and respect. These women held privileges that ordinary women did not. They could own wealth, hold influence, and stand in spaces traditionally reserved for men. In many ways, they had escaped the narrow confines of gender roles, only to find themselves bound to something much more demanding: the duty to fight and, if necessary, die for their kingdom. On the battlefield, the Mino built a reputation that inspired both fear and respect. Their tactics relied on speed, shock, and unrelenting aggression. They were often deployed in the most dangerous parts of a battle, where their ferocity could break enemy lines. Eyewitness accounts from both African rivals and European observers described them as unstoppable once the charge began. They fought with machetes, muskets, and sheer determination, often overwhelming larger forces with their courage and coordination. One of their most important roles was in Dahomey's slave-raiding campaigns. Each year, the kingdom launched expeditions to capture people from neighboring regions, fueling the transatlantic slave trade that enriched the state. The Mino often led these expeditions, striking terror into villages and overpowering rivals. Their actions supplied captives for trade, but also reinforced Dahomey's dominance in the region. But their power did not end on the battlefield. The Mino also played an important role in the political life of the kingdom. Senior officers were part of the royal court and sat in the Grand Council, where they advised the king and influenced decisions. In a deeply patriarchal time, this level of authority for women was almost unheard of. It made Dahomey a unique society where women could hold positions of real power, not only through warfare, but also through governance. This dual role, as both warriors and advisors, elevated the Mino beyond the status of soldiers. They were guardians of the throne, enforcers of the king's will, and symbols of the kingdom's strength. Their existence challenged European notions of gender roles, and even today, their story disrupts common assumptions about women's place in history. By the late 19th century, the Mino faced their greatest challenge. European colonial powers were carving up Africa, and France set its sights on Dahomey. The result was the brutal series of conflicts known as the Franco-Dahomean Wars. The French army was armed with modern rifles, machine guns, and artillery. The Mino, though courageous, could not match this level of firepower. Yet their bravery during these wars became the stuff of legend. Accounts describe Mino warriors charging into battle under a hail of bullets, advancing with machetes raised, refusing to retreat even when faced with certain death. French soldiers, though victorious, could not help but admire their fearlessness. Many recorded their respect for these women who fought with such determination against impossible odds. Ultimately, Dahomey was defeated. By 1894, the kingdom was annexed into French colonial territory, and the Mino were officially disbanded. For the surviving warriors, life after the army was difficult. Having dedicated their entire existence to war and celibacy, many found it hard to reintegrate into civilian life. Some lived in obscurity, their once fearsome identities now only memories. Yet the legacy of the Mino endures. In Benin today, they are remembered as non-mutant, or our mothers. They stand as symbols of courage, resilience, and the power of women in history. Their story is a reminder that women have always been capable of greatness when given the opportunity. The Mino challenged the silence of history, a silence that too often erases the contributions of women in warfare and leadership. They were not myths, not legends, but real women who stood against enemies, empires, and history itself. Their story reminds us of a truth that cannot be ignored. Women were not only present in history, they shaped it, they fought for it, and in the case of the Dahomey Amazons, they were willing to conquer or die for it. So, the next time you hear someone say history was written only by men, remember the Mino. Remember the fearless women of Dahomey who terrified empires and left a legacy that still echoes through time.